He beat him until there were no more pleas, no more breath. And when he buried him, his son was still alive. Then the father whispered, "You are no longer my son. My son is dead." And then, he simply kept on burying him. What must break inside a father's mind for him to nearly beat his only son to death, and then start burying him alive, with his own hands? The summer of 2007 in Savannah, Georgia, burned with its usual southern heat, but inside the modest two-story home of Elijah and Rosalind Brooks, the air carried a different kind of intensity, one built on reverence, gratitude, and fragile hope. Theirs was not a house of abundance or extravagance, but it overflowed with a kind of sacred quiet that came only after years of grief and loss. Every corner of the house seemed to whisper stories of prayers whispered into the night, of hospital rooms filled with silence, and of days that bled into nights without answers. Elijah and Rosalind had tried for a child for over a decade. Their journey was a long and winding road marked by heartbreak, 6 miscarriages over the course of 11 years. Each loss had hollowed them a little more, carving out space for grief in places that once held dreams. The house had once had a nursery painted in warm yellows, decorated with plush animals and soft blankets, but over time it became a storage room, as if trying to hide the evidence of hope betrayed. Yet through every loss, they held on to each other, walking hand in hand through the dark corridors of mourning. Then, in the winter of 1998, Rosalind became pregnant again. The doctors warned them not to get their hopes up. Her body was weakened, her womb worn thin by the weight of repeated loss. Still, this time felt different. Each week the child survived felt like a miracle carved out of defiance. Elijah stopped drinking coffee, stopped watching late-night television, stopped anything that might bring bad energy into the house. Rosalind lay in bed for most of the pregnancy, counting heartbeats on monitors and clutching ultrasound photos like talismans. And then, on a warm spring morning in May 1999, Christopher was born. He came into the world with a quiet cry and wide, dark eyes that seemed older than his minutes. The doctors called it a textbook birth, but to Elijah and Rosalind, it was nothing short of divine intervention. Christopher was healthy, strong, and perfect. He became the center of their lives instantly. Elijah stared at his son as if he had been handed the sun itself. Rosalind wept when she held him, overwhelmed not just by love, but by the release of years of sorrow compressed into a single, life-changing moment. In the months that followed, their home transformed. The once still rooms filled with the soft sounds of lullabies and tiny feet kicking against blankets. Elijah took thousands of photos, first smiles, first steps, first messy attempts at solid food. He printed them, labeled them, framed them, as if trying to preserve every detail of the miracle that now lived under their roof. Rosalind became vigilant, monitoring Christopher's every breath, watching over him with the kind of intensity that only comes from knowing what it's like to lose. When Christopher was 2, Rosalind became pregnant again. The news brought a strange mix of excitement and fear. For weeks, Elijah walked on eggshells, terrified of the cycle repeating. And it did. This time, it was a stillbirth. A girl. She had formed fully but passed in the womb. Rosalind went quiet in the days that followed. She stared out the window for hours, her hands folded in her lap, her thoughts miles away. The doctors said her body could no longer endure pregnancy. A necessary surgery followed, a final closing of the door on any possibility of more children. The physical recovery was brief, the emotional wound never truly healed. From that moment on, Christopher wasn't just their son. He was everything. He was every sibling that never got to be born. He was the sum of all their dreams and fears. Elijah poured his ambitions into the boy, and Rosalind wrapped him in a cocoon of care that bordered on obsession. They spared no effort, no cost, no time. Christopher went to the best preschool they could afford, wore the cleanest clothes, and had a bed that felt like a throne. His toys were carefully selected, his meals balanced and organic, his bedtime routine sacred. Family gatherings often hovered awkwardly around Christopher. Cousins were told not to play too roughly. Aunts and uncles whispered behind polite smiles about how protected he was. But Elijah didn't care. He had lost too much to take any chances. Rosalind would wake in the middle of the night just to check if their son was still breathing. Sometimes she'd place her ear against his chest. Other times she'd sit beside his crib and watch his chest rise and fall in the darkness. As the years passed, the weight of expectation slowly wrapped itself around the child. He didn't understand why his parents looked at him with such intensity. He didn't know why every scraped knee caused Rosalind to cry, or why Elijah sometimes stared at him as if searching for something more than a boy. To Christopher, life was simple. He laughed, he played, he learned. But around him, a world had been constructed where he was not just a son. He was salvation. The Brooks family was defined by him. Their marriage had survived through his birth. Their hopes had found new shape through his growth. And as he grew taller, learned his letters, and started asking questions about the world, his parents watched in awe. Not just at what he was becoming, but at the miracle that he still existed at all. To Elijah, Christopher wasn't just the only light in the house. He was the proof that even after endless darkness, something bright and warm could still break through. As Christopher grew, the fragility that had once defined his existence began to shed like an old skin. By the age of 10, his body moved with surprising agility and strength. He was lean but powerful, the kind of child whose energy was tightly coiled, waiting for purpose. Elijah noticed it first in the way his son climbed trees with ease, how he raced ahead without tiring, how his reflexes seemed just a little sharper than those of the other boys on the street. Rosalind, ever cautious, worried about injuries, but Elijah saw something else, potential. Something that could be shaped, molded, and directed toward greatness. And so, he introduced Christopher to wrestling. It began with local classes at a community center gym, a modest room with worn mats and second-hand headgear. At first, Christopher fumbled with the techniques, confused by the discipline and frustrated by his own inexperience. But within weeks, he found rhythm. He started to understand the language of movement, where to shift weight, how to anticipate an opponent's grip, when to explode with force and when to yield. It came to him like instinct. Elijah watched from the bleachers, heart pounding, as his son pinned down boys older and larger with a quiet determination. The pride he felt was almost overwhelming. Wrestling quickly became more than a sport, it was a ritual. Every day after school, Christopher would train. Elijah picked him up, drove him to practice, and waited in the car with thermoses of protein shakes and folded towels. He never missed a match. Win or lose, Elijah stood clapping on the sidelines, eyes glistening with something deeper than pride. To him, each victory was a confirmation that Christopher was strong, not just physically but in spirit. That despite everything, the losses, the medical warnings, the surgery that ended their dreams of a bigger family, their son was more than enough. At home, the garage transformed into a private training space. Elijah saved up for mats, padded the walls with foam, and built a makeshift weight bench. He brought home instructional DVDs, studied techniques alongside his son, and built weekly training plans. Together, they recorded matches and dissected them late into the night, father and son leaning over a laptop, analyzing angles and balance. They spoke a language only they seemed to understand: grips, escapes, reversals, balance points. It wasn't just a hobby. It was a shared mission. Rosalind watched this bond with both warmth and unease. She appreciated the closeness but saw how much Elijah had invested in it, how wrestling had become a channel for dreams unspoken. There were no more conversations about trying for another child, no more nursery talk, no discussions about adoption. That chapter had closed, and now Elijah poured everything into Christopher. Every loss on the mat felt personal. Every win, redemptive. Christopher adapted to the pressure with a calm maturity that surprised even his coaches. He didn't gloat in victory or sulk in defeat. He internalized lessons, kept his focus, and showed a quiet leadership that made others gravitate toward him. He wasn't the loudest in the locker room or the strongest on paper, but he was respected. Elijah often said it was the discipline that mattered most, the ability to persevere when things got hard. And Christopher, knowingly or not, embodied that. By the time he reached his early teens, Christopher had already earned a reputation in the regional youth circuit. Coaches from local high schools took notice. Trophies accumulated on the shelf in the living room, each one polished and lined with care. Elijah made space for them with almost ceremonial reverence. He bought display cases, framed photos, and mounted medals on the wall. He spoke about scholarships with quiet urgency, already imagining a future where Christopher could compete at the collegiate level, maybe even more. Wrestling became the family's North Star, everything aligned behind it. Even weekend meals were scheduled around weigh-ins and training routines. Rosalind adjusted her cooking, learned how to track macronutrients, and kept a chart on the fridge listing his weight to the decimal. Family vacations were postponed for tournaments, holidays spent in rented gyms instead of around fireplaces. And yet, there was joy in it. The kind of joy that came from structure, from shared goals, from watching someone you love become exactly what you hoped they could be. Elijah never said it aloud, but every time Christopher stepped onto the mat, he saw more than just his son. He saw proof that love could survive tragedy, that strength could grow out of pain. Each muscle in Christopher's body was a reminder of the years they had waited, of the nights spent grieving, of the child they thought they would never hold. Wrestling was not just about competition, it was a shield, a fortress, a way to protect the only thing they had. The neighborhood watched the Brooks family with a kind of respectful admiration. People saw Elijah and Christopher jogging at dawn, practicing takedowns in the backyard, laughing between rounds of sparring. They saw Rosalind sitting in the bleachers with her hands clasped, her eyes scanning every move her son made. To outsiders, they looked like the perfect family, focused, united, driven by love. No one could see the fragility beneath the surface. No one knew how much was being held together by sheer will. Christopher never questioned the attention or the structure. It was the only life he knew. He didn't mind the routines, the sacrifices, or the expectations. In many ways, they gave him purpose. But deep inside, a quiet tension began to stir, questions he didn't yet know how to ask, truths he wasn't ready to confront. He loved his father, honored his mother, and devoted himself to the path they had paved. Yet as his body grew stronger, his spirit began to drift in directions no one could predict. For now, though, he remained their hope, their pride, and their only light. It was a Saturday afternoon in late spring when Christopher brought Riley home for the first time. The sky was bright and the air carried the smell of fresh-cut grass and barbecue charcoal. Elijah stood by the grill in the backyard, flipping seasoned chicken thighs with practiced ease, while Rosalind prepared lemonade in the kitchen. The house buzzed with a soft energy, the kind that hovered around weekends when the family was whole and the world felt unhurried. When Riley appeared beside Christopher at the gate, Elijah immediately noticed something different. Riley had a disarming presence. He was tall for his age, broad-shouldered, with a quiet confidence that didn't come across as arrogance. His smile was genuine, his handshake firm, and his eyes held a look of attention that Elijah respected. Within minutes, he was helping arrange lawn chairs, asking Elijah about his grilling techniques, and complimenting Rosalind's garden with a surprising knowledge of plants. He wasn't just polite, he was warm, aware, and entirely at ease. Elijah, who often kept a cautious distance from people outside the family, found himself leaning into conversation, listening, even laughing. As the day stretched on, Riley's ease only deepened. He tossed a football with Christopher across the yard, helped clean up without being asked, and spoke with an earnestness that felt rare for someone his age. By the time the sun dipped below the fence line, Elijah had begun to feel something that caught him off guard, something like yearning. Watching the two boys joke and wrestle on the grass brought up old visions, the kinds he had long buried after Rosalind's final surgery. Visions of a second child, a brother for Christopher, a bigger table, louder dinners, and the vibrant chaos of more. Riley began visiting more frequently after that. At first it was casual, weekends, the occasional evening hangout, but quickly, his presence became regular. Elijah started driving him home from practice, sometimes picking him up before. They invited him to movie nights, Sunday brunches, and neighborhood events. Elijah bought him snacks he liked, asked about his schoolwork, even taught him how to tie a proper tie before a school formal. He noticed how Riley listened when he spoke, how he asked questions about life, about being a man, about struggle and perseverance. It was like mentoring someone who didn't just want attention, but guidance. Something about that filled a hollow space that had long since gone silent inside Elijah. The bond between the three of them, Elijah, Christopher, and Riley, began to resemble something bigger than friendship. It was almost familial. Elijah began referring to them, even in casual conversation, as the boys. They went fishing together at the nearby lake, spent hours fixing up an old bike in the garage, and watched sports late into the night while Rosalind slept. There was laughter, energy, a kind of shared masculinity that made Elijah feel alive in a way he hadn't in years. With Christopher and Riley at his side, he no longer felt like a man trying to protect a single flame in the dark. He felt surrounded by light. But not everyone felt that way. Rosalind began to notice subtle shifts in the house. Riley's shoes by the door, his voice echoing through the hallway, his name appearing more and more in daily plans. Her dinners became meals for four, her laundry included unfamiliar shirts, and her weekend routines were reorganized around a boy who wasn't hers. At first, she told herself it was temporary, that Riley was just going through a rough patch, that Elijah was being kind. But the visits never slowed. They increased. And with each passing week, Riley seemed less like a guest and more like a fixture. Rosalind watched Elijah closely. She saw the way his face lit up when Riley walked in, the way he stood taller, spoke louder, became somehow more animated. She recognized something dangerous in it, not a romantic affection, but something deeper, more personal. Elijah had poured all his hope into one son, and now he was spilling into another. She wondered if he even saw it. If he noticed how much space Riley was beginning to take up in their lives. Not just physically, but emotionally. The quiet late-night conversations in the living room, the shared inside jokes that excluded her, the growing sense that decisions about the family now involved someone outside of it. She voiced her concerns gently at first, questions, observations, casual remarks. But Elijah waved them off, dismissing her discomfort as paranoia or jealousy. He didn't understand how she could view kindness as a threat. How she could see Riley as anything other than a blessing. But Rosalind saw what he refused to see. Riley wasn't just a friend to Christopher. He was becoming a surrogate son to Elijah. A stand-in for the child they never had. And though no one said it out loud, the dynamics in the house began to shift around that unspoken truth. Christopher, for his part, seemed untouched by the storm brewing beneath the surface. He was happy to have Riley around, content with the closeness, the shared interests, the camaraderie. To him, their bond was natural, uncomplicated. But Rosalind watched closely, noting how his demeanor subtly changed when Elijah was around Riley. There was a tension in his shoulders sometimes, a hesitance in his eyes. She couldn't quite name it, but it lingered, thick and unspoken, like a shadow trailing the light of their family's joy. The transformation was slow, like a fog settling over a field, so gradual that no one noticed it until it was already dense. Riley had a toothbrush in the upstairs bathroom. He had a blanket draped over the living room couch. He had a key, though no one remembered when it was given. Elijah stopped referring to him as Christopher's friend and simply called him Riley. He sat at the table like he belonged there. He spoke to Rosalind like he was her son. And although he was always polite, always grateful, his presence began to choke the balance of the home. Rosalind felt it in her chest, in the still moments of the night when the house was quiet. She would sit awake, listening to the laughter of three voices downstairs, hers being the one left out. She felt like a guest in her own home, a woman slowly displaced by a boy who had found a way to fit perfectly into a gap she hadn't realized was still open. The shadow of the second son had crept in, and no one seemed to notice how cold the house had become beneath it. By late summer, Riley was no longer just a frequent guest, he had become woven into the daily fabric of the Brooks household. His presence was constant, familiar, and seemingly accepted by everyone except Rosalind, who watched the dynamic shift with increasing unease. The balance of the home had tipped, though it was difficult to say when it had happened. Perhaps it was the day Elijah rearranged the weekend schedule around Riley's wrestling meet. Or maybe it was when Riley began spending nights without asking, his overnight bag quietly tucked into the corner of Christopher's room. Whatever the moment, the shift had taken root, and the household now orbited around a new axis. The trio, Elijah, Christopher, and Riley, moved as a unit. They shared inside jokes, planned weekend trips, and spent long hours in the garage lifting weights or working on the old truck Elijah had once intended to restore alone. Riley picked up Elijah's habits, the way he sipped his coffee black, how he folded his tools back into the toolbox with precision, how he spoke about discipline and grit. Elijah, in turn, began to refer to Riley as one of his own. Not explicitly, never out loud in front of Rosalind, but in the way he introduced him to others, in the way his hand lingered on Riley's shoulder, in the way he spoke of him with pride. Fishing trips became a ritual. Early Saturday mornings, the three of them would rise before dawn, load gear into the back of the truck, and disappear for hours. They returned sunburned and laughing, retelling exaggerated stories of almost catches over dinner. The photographs from these trips, three men framed against quiet lakes and pine forests, began to decorate the living room. One of the pictures even found its way into Elijah's wallet, replacing an older photo of Christopher as a toddler. Rosalind noticed but said nothing. Words felt futile now, smothered beneath the growing silence between her and her husband. She tried to reclaim space in small ways, dinners without Riley, movie nights with just the three of them, reminders that this was still her home, still her family. But Elijah always found a way to include Riley. Sometimes it was subtle, sometimes blunt. If she objected, he called her cold. If she questioned his judgment, he accused her of resentment. He couldn't understand why she didn't see Riley for what he was, a blessing, a second chance. Elijah never said it outright, but his actions betrayed a truth that lived beneath every choice he made. Riley filled a space that had never healed. A space left vacant by dreams of a second child that would never come. Tension settled over the marriage like a slow-rolling fog. Rosalind felt the walls closing in around her. The house was full, but she had never felt more alone. The kitchen, once her sanctuary, now echoed with male laughter. The living room, once a space for quiet conversation and shared moments, had become a domain of sports games and boisterous camaraderie. Her voice, once heard and respected, was drowned out by the rhythm of the new dynamic. She found herself retreating into the background, observing more than participating, her words swallowed by the thick air of avoidance. It all reached a boiling point on an unremarkable Wednesday evening. Riley had stayed over again without notice. Christopher and Elijah were in the backyard setting up a fire pit for a spontaneous cookout. The smell of smoked meat clung to the curtains, and the television blared a game in the background. Rosalind stood at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in soapy water, watching them through the window as Riley tossed a football to Elijah and Christopher laughed nearby. Something inside her broke. She dried her hands, walked outside, and confronted Elijah, not in anger, but in desperation. She needed to be heard, to be seen, to be acknowledged in the life she had helped build. But Elijah was defensive, guarded. He dismissed her concerns, accused her of ingratitude. He said Riley brought something into their lives they had needed: energy, strength, companionship. When Rosalind reminded him of everything they had already built, everything they had overcome together, he turned cold. Then came the words that sliced through the heart of their marriage like a blade. He told her she had failed to give him another son. That Riley was the son he never had. That maybe if things had been different, if her body hadn't betrayed them, he wouldn't have needed to find that bond elsewhere. The words were cruel, sharpened by years of unspoken grief and resentment. Rosalind said nothing in return. Her silence was not weakness, but shock, a stillness born of pain too deep to articulate. That night, she packed a small bag and left the house, retreating to her sister's home on the other side of town. She needed distance, clarity, and above all, space to breathe. She believed, perhaps naively, that Elijah would come to his senses. That he would realize the damage his words had done. That he would miss her presence and find his way back to their shared foundation. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the fracture had already widened beyond repair. At home, Elijah said little about her absence. When Christopher asked, he offered vague answers. Riley continued to stay over. The laughter resumed. The meals went on. The house, from the outside, still appeared functional. But beneath the surface, the current had changed. The boundary between what was familial and what was inappropriate had begun to blur. Elijah, fueled by stubbornness and unresolved longing, began to see Riley less as a guest and more as kin. As someone who had earned his place in the family. As someone who fit into a narrative Elijah had written long ago, one where nothing was ever lost, only replaced. The line between right and wrong had thinned. What had once been a friendship was now something more intimate, more complex, more dangerous. And though no one said it, though the walls of the Brooks household still stood tall and proud, something vital had already cracked beneath them. A man who once cherished order had begun to lose control. And a home built on love, grief, and hope had started to teeter on the edge of something irreversible. After Rosalind left, the house became quieter in a way that didn't bother Elijah at first. He moved through the rooms as if reclaiming them, adjusting furniture, discarding old picture frames, reorganizing the kitchen drawers. Without her presence, the space felt lighter to him, more flexible. He cooked when he wanted, left the television on late, and invited Riley to stay the night without hesitation or awkwardness. The absence of her voice was initially soothing, a silence that allowed him to focus entirely on what he believed still mattered, his bond with Christopher and the surrogate brotherhood he had created with Riley. In an effort to solidify that bond and escape the unease that lingered in the air, Elijah proposed a camping trip. He wanted something simple and grounding, just the three of them, away from town, away from tension. He scoured maps for quiet lockshores, found a secluded campsite miles off the highway, and planned out every detail: fishing poles, freeze-dried meals, sleeping bags, even a portable fire pit. It would be a male rite of passage, a gesture to reinforce the closeness they had built, a return to something pure. He imagined long nights under the stars, stories by the fire, and shared laughter that would drown out the memory of harsh words spoken in the kitchen days before. He felt a rush of satisfaction as he packed the gear into the truck bed. The sun was high, the sky clear. He rehearsed the words he would use to announce the trip, picturing Christopher's smile, imagining Riley's excitement. As he moved through the hallway toward Christopher's room, he felt a rare warmth in his chest, a fleeting sense that things might truly fall back into place. That maybe, just maybe, this trip would mend what had frayed. He didn't knock when he opened the bedroom door. He didn't expect to need to. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. The room was dim, the curtains pulled halfway shut, but the outlines were clear. Christopher and Riley were tangled in the bedsheets, their bodies pressed together, their closeness unmistakable. There was no denying what they were doing, no possibility of misinterpretation. For a moment, Elijah stood frozen, his breath caught somewhere between his chest and throat. The sound of his heartbeat roared in his ears. Then, the warmth drained from his body like a vanishing tide. He turned sharply and left the room, his footsteps uneven and heavy. His mind couldn't form words. There was only a blur of emotion, rage, betrayal, confusion, shame. The trust he had built, the structure he had worshipped, the vision of his family, all of it collapsed under the weight of what he had seen. 1,000 moments flashed in his mind: childhood hugs, fishing poles held side by side, medals accepted after matches. He felt as if he had been deceived at every turn. Riley was gone by the time Elijah returned. No one had to tell him to leave. The door was left slightly ajar, as if an apology or cowardice. Elijah walked past it, his face expressionless. He didn't speak to Christopher. He didn't demand an explanation. Instead, he waited until nightfall. Darkness had settled over the house like a heavy curtain. Elijah sat in the living room for hours, unmoving, his hands clenched into fists resting on his knees. The silence pressed in around him. When he finally rose, it was with a singular purpose. He walked slowly to the garage, retrieved the shovel, and stepped into the backyard where the earth was soft near the fence line. He dug in silence. Each movement was mechanical, not frantic, measured, practiced, almost ceremonial. The moon offered little light, but he didn't need it. He knew this ground. He had once planted flowers here with Rosalind. Inside, Christopher remained in his room. He hadn't come out, hadn't spoken, hadn't moved. Eventually, Elijah entered. The air between them was thick, immobile. What happened next was not quick. It was not clean. It was rage manifest, heavy, brutal, and terrifying. Elijah struck Christopher with a force that came from somewhere beneath years of grief, somewhere beneath the layers of disappointment, confusion, and the failed expectations he had never voiced. Blow after blow, he let out the pain that had never found words. When the boy crumpled to the floor, barely conscious, Elijah dragged him outside. Christopher's face was bloody, swollen, but his eyes still held something. Terror, disbelief, and above all, desperation. He begged, his voice barely audible, his body trembling. But Elijah didn't hear his son. He heard a stranger. A lie. A life that no longer fit the story he had spent so long building. He dropped him beside the hole and stood over him, repeating the same sentence over and over, like a prayer twisted into condemnation. You are not my son. My son is gone. My son is dead. The night swallowed everything. Christopher's cries echoed briefly, then faded beneath Elijah's breathing and the rustle of disturbed soil. He didn't finish the burial. Somewhere between rage and exhaustion, he stopped. His hands were shaking, his heart thudding against his ribs. He couldn't bring himself to cover the body completely. Instead, he left it there, half covered, half exposed, as if unable to commit to the finality of what he had done. When he returned inside, he was not the same man who had packed the truck that morning. His body was covered in dirt, blood on his shirt, sweat dried in streaks on his face. He walked to the kitchen and sat down at the table, hands resting flat on the surface. He didn't wash. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just stared, unblinking, as if waiting for something to pull him out of the abyss he had entered. The house was silent again, but not with peace. It was the silence of aftermath, of something shattered beyond repair. The silence of a man who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Rosalind returned home just before sunrise, expecting the tension of the previous days to have given way to reflection and remorse. She imagined Elijah tired and contrite, waiting in the kitchen with a quiet apology and an attempt at reconciliation. The early morning light spilled through the windows as she unlocked the door, her movements careful, her heart conflicted between hope and hesitation. The house was still. No sound of footsteps, no clatter of coffee mugs, no television murmuring in the background. The silence was heavier than it should have been. She called out once, softly, but received no reply. The living room was untouched, yet something felt off. A faint, metallic scent lingered in the air, mingling with the faint trace of last night's charcoal smoke. The house, usually so familiar, now felt like a stranger wearing the skin of her home. She walked slowly into the kitchen and stopped in the doorway. Elijah was there, seated at the table, his arms resting on the surface, palms flat. His clothes were stained, his face pale and streaked with dry tears. His eyes were wide open, but unfocused, fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of the room. For a long moment, neither moved. Rosalind couldn't speak. Her gaze scanned him and then fell to the dark smudges on the floor, trailing like a broken sentence leading to something terrible. Her breath caught in her throat as she noticed the dirt beneath his fingernails, the crusted blood on his knuckles, the quiet shaking of his shoulders. He didn't look at her. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, barely audible. "There's no more sun," he said. That was all. The room spun around her, the edges of reality blurring with fear. Rosalind backed away, her trembling fingers fumbling for her phone. Within minutes, the sirens arrived. Red and blue lights bathed the front lawn as police entered the house. Elijah didn't resist. He didn't protest. He stood up when instructed, answered every question with silence, and let himself be handcuffed as if it were a formality long expected. His eyes never met Rosalind's as he was led away. The backyard was soon swarmed with officers and crime scene technicians. The sight of Christopher's battered, barely covered body broke something in Rosalind that could never be repaired. She fell to her knees, wailing in a way that ripped through the air like a storm. Her son, her miracle, her only child, lay lifeless beneath the very soil where she had once planted spring flowers. The same ground where he had taken his first steps. Where Elijah had taught him to throw a ball. Where birthdays were celebrated and summer dinners had been enjoyed. Now it was a grave, shallow and brutal, a place of betrayal. The investigation moved quickly. The evidence was overwhelming: bloody clothes, the battered body, Elijah's quiet confession. The news swept through the neighborhood like wildfire. Headlines spread the tragedy: local father kills son in alleged outburst. The Brooks family, once seen as a model of resilience and love, became the subject of hushed conversations and horrified glances. Church members left flowers at the gate. Neighbors lowered their eyes in shame when passing the house. Everyone had known them. No one had seen this coming. The trial began in the dead of winter. Rosalind sat alone in the courtroom, dressed in black, a shell of the woman she had once been. Elijah appeared in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists bound, his face gaunt. He never once looked at her. The prosecution laid out the details: the assault, the burial attempt, the motive tangled in grief and fractured masculinity. No plea for leniency was made. Elijah never tried to defend his actions. He admitted what he had done but refused to explain why. Perhaps he didn't know himself. Or perhaps he knew too well and lacked the words. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There were no cheers, no sighs of relief. Only silence. The courtroom emptied slowly, leaving Rosalind seated in the front row, clutching a folded photo of Christopher, smiling, alive, unbroken. That image would never change. She would make sure of that. It was all she had left. After the sentencing, Rosalind returned to the house only once. The rooms were too quiet, too full of ghosts. She stood in Christopher's bedroom for an hour, touching the wrestling medals still pinned to the wall, running her fingers over the worn edges of his textbooks, and hailing the last traces of his scent on a pillow. She didn't cry. There were no tears left. Only a hollow ache where joy had once lived. She sold the house and moved in with her sister, who had offered her space but not words. There were none that could soothe that kind of loss. Rosalind spoke rarely. Her days became routine: morning walks, quiet meals, and long evenings watching the light fade through a window. She avoided the news, ignored messages, and declined every invitation. What had once been a world filled with plans, laughter, and purpose was now reduced to memory and echo. In the prison, Elijah aged quickly. His hair grayed within months, his eyes dulled. Other inmates avoided him, sensing the depth of his remorse or perhaps fearing the silence that surrounded him. He read books but never finished them. He ate but never tasted the food. He refused visitors, including Rosalind. Letters went unanswered. Time moved, but he remained still. A man who had once built his life on fatherhood now existed in a space where he was neither husband, nor father, nor man. Just a presence fading behind locked doors. Christopher's grave was modest. Rosalind chose a simple headstone with his name, birthdate, and the words "Forever Loved." She visited every week, bringing the same bouquet of white lilies. Sometimes she spoke to him, sometimes she didn't. The cemetery was quiet, removed from the world's noise. There, she could remember him not as a tragedy, but as the child she had held through sleepless nights, the boy who had laughed in the sun, the young man who had once made her believe that anything was possible. What remained was not peace. It was not closure. It was a life reassembled from fragments, lived quietly in the shadow of what could never be undone. For Rosalind, every day was a negotiation with memory, every breath a reminder of what she had lost. And in that stillness, in that slow, aching silence, she carried on. Not because she wanted to, but because there was nothing else left.